Hello and welcome to another edition of the Darshan Project. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Muhurta. And this is basically a tool in Jyotish, and actually a whole branch of Jyotish, dedicated to finding the most auspicious time to start certain endeavors. There is actually a portion of time called Muhurta, which has a little overlap, but this is technically its own branch of astrology, and it has many uses, and we're going to get into it here. It's one of my kind of holds a soft place in my heart. It was the first thing I learned when I started learning Jyotish from my first teacher, and so I've had a lot of experience using it over time and have seen the results, and I think it's really one of the more practical things that, people who don't read charts and do things, it's one of the more practical things that you can take home with you and really start to apply in your daily life with astrology to help you kind of mitigate some of the hurdles that you might come into from day to day and have your life be as smooth as possible, and over time see the effects of these things when you put it into action and use it for selecting timings for different things. So to look at some of the basic ideas around Muhurta is it's really meant to help, once again, mitigate any kind of negative effects for whatever kind of undertaking we want to do. And this can be for the positive or the negative, so that you can choose muhurtas to go to war, for example, if you're a nation or a king, or if you're trying to defeat an enemy or go to a battle, you can choose a good muhurta for legal issues too, which I actually have uses for that. So with great effect. So there is it's not just positive, where I want to or what's assumed to be positive. Let's put it that way. I want to get a lot of money, or I want my marriage to go well, which is all part of it. But it's just whatever endeavor you can think of, you can use this knowledge to instigate that. And it's used in tantric practices. If you're doing specific tantric practices, you need to have some knowledge of this in order to undertake the proper time for certain practices. And if you're doing general yogic practices, you often say titi and vara names and different things in the beginning of traditional mantra practices or pujas and things like that. So it has a wide range of effects, but it's very practical and useful. And one of the big things with it, though, is that it can't override the birth chart. So you always have to go back to the person's birth chart. So even if you pick the best possible muhurta for, say, starting to write a book, or getting married, or trying to have children, any of these things, if the birth chart doesn't really support those kind of activities, I don't care how much you sit down and try to write a book, even if you picked a great muhurta, if writing isn't in your chart, or fame, or more importantly, if the right dasha cycle isn't coming around for that activity at that time, then the results aren't going to fructify. So you do still need a reading from a Jyotishi, or from your own knowledge. If you're already in a field of work, for example, and you're already doing something, then you can use this for certain endeavors if you already are a writer, for example. But it all gets tapered back to the birth chart. So don't think just because you picked this muhurta to do this activity you want to do, if it doesn't work out, there may be other mitigating factors preventing you from doing such. So you can use it for big events, like marriage, like writing a symphony, taking initiation from a guru, any number of things. You can pick those events, but it also has a lot of day-to-day application. People pick muhurtas to go shopping or get their hair cut. So it has even mundane levels that can be useful, and you don't need as many details to apply those general muhurtas and still get effect and see effects with them. So just a really important point to keep in mind as we get into this information. And once again, as I've already covered it, it has a wide variety of uses, as I've mentioned, and you'll see this in all the ancient shastra all the time. There's, good times for the first haircut on the child, uh, first time for the child to leave the house. Uh, so many different uses for this knowledge, and while that's good and it's applicable, it's important not to get obsessed with it. It's a really easy trap, especially with this field. I think Jyotish in general, it's easy to get obsessed and start seeing everything through the chart and the movements of planets and kind of get stuck in that mind frame, which is really really limiting after a while. But especially with this, a lot of people who maybe have had some setbacks in their life, and which is generally people who study a lot of Jyotish, there's a certain fear that comes up in them, and so you may overuse some of this knowledge and try to pick the perfect timing for all these little actions you're doing, and I fell into that trap when I first started learning the stuff, and and part of it was a learning process. I was just trying to see how it was working and what the effects were in different circumstances. So at first, it may be useful to kind of get into it just to really understand the movements of each of these things. But over time, don't get trapped in that where you won't leave the house without uh, you know planning out every sequence of your day based on the muhurta. It's okay to get a general feel, in the morning for where the planets are and everything, so you know what to expect. But just be careful of not getting overly obsessed with what's going on here. Except for when you have major life events, then it really, really pays to pay attention to all these details that I'm going to get into. Just a little overview of what this lecture, this course is going to cover. First, we're going to look at the Panchang. So, the Panchang, as we covered in our previous lecture, I introduced you to that within the framework of more of looking at birth charts and reading the Panchang elements from a birth chart. And those still apply a lot in the Muhurta. And Muhurta is, in general, based for the most part on the movement of the moon and the placement of the moon, and the Panchang elements, which combines moon sun kind of placements. But it's really the Panchang that sets the basis for picking a good Muhurta. And so we're gonna focus a lot on that and those 5 different elements. So like I said, you've already become familiar from the last lecture. If not, go over those elements, understand the rulers of the different divisions, and because it's going to be really useful segue to come into this to help understand applying it to a muhurta and picking auspicious timings, and that's the basis of muhurta. And the basis is this idea that just like the birth chart, that kind of sets the tone for anything to happen. So the idea with the muhurta is, if you pick the beginning of an event to have the best possible, planetary influences, then the rest of that event will unfold to its highest capacity. And a saying that's often quoted is, "A job started well is a job half done." And so that's the idea behind the picking these muhurtas. And sometimes, coming in line with that is you might have to wait. When the right time could be very strange hours. So people who rely on this, I've seen, sometimes marriages, they get married in the middle of the night because that's the best muhurta to get married at, 10 p.m., 12 p.m., all sorts of strange timings. Or you might have to wait, 3-4 months to start an endeavor because that's a more optimum timing. And I've given muhurtas to people, friends and things like that, who have been heads of organizations or moving into houses, and they there's a tendency to want to push things on a certain schedule for a lot of reasons. And I've often warned people to not for various placements, and they don't take this information too lightly. And I've seen time and again where they have a lot, and I've seen the muhurtas that they've chosen to go with without considering things at all. And I can just see that you can see the obstacles just lining up one after another based on it. So it might seem insignificant, but it's actually really useful in planning your day-to-day activities. So We look at the Panchang elements. We'll go into various yogas, and these are just how these different elements line up. So how different tithis and different nakshatras and days of the week, how those line up, and there's a lot of mitigating influences to where even though in general sometimes may not seem good when certain influences align, just like in a birth chart, there's certain yogas for planets and houses and things like that. Within the elements of the Panchang, certain things line up either for really positive indications or also really negative indications. So this can really help you avoid some hiccups when you're looking at timings. And they're once again, they're specific to the Panchang, and a lot of them I haven't seen in a lot of places. I got this from teachings from my teacher, so these are some nuggets that I'll be passing on to you that I haven't come across readily out there. So really useful information. And then after that, we'll look at specifically the Rashi chart and a little bit of the Navamsha to see how to fine tune once you get a date based on the Panchang and these different yogas we're looking at. Then you want to pick, a certain ascendant and specific time within the day with which to undertake your endeavor. And there's a lot of different little factors that get into that, but at this point in the course, you've got a grounding in the birth chart and everything. So this is going to bring some of that information into this picking of times and round out the Muhurta knowledge as well. And from there, we'll go into, once again, some more special factors and considerations to take into effect with these. So there's lots of little details. And the basic idea is there's lots of overlapping energies and patterns. And you're never going to get an exactly perfect Muhurta where everything is just green light. We're going to go through a lot of different options and different patterns, and the basic idea with picking the time is you pick the one where it's the most positive influences that are going to garner the most strength for the specific event that you're choosing. And so there's a lot of things to take into consideration, and along with that, we'll look at specific things that also are more useful within kind of day-to-day planning, where you're not going to look at all the planetary placements and the Panchang placements, and we'll just look at some knowledge where if you need to pick a time to do something really quickly within a day or a couple days during the week, you can quickly pick a time that might be more conducive to what you're doing. And those day-to-day things too can be even one more layer you can put on top of choosing the Panchang information, but it won't be as crucial if you're taking care of what we looked at previous. And from there, we'll look into specific situations. So, commencing an education or starting a new business or taking a medical procedure. We'll look at some specific indications that are good for those specific activities, because there's lots of details when you really want to hone in on something very important like that to take into effect as well. And one more thing to make sure that you've got that best time to start your endeavor. And lastly, I'll give you some practice to do and part of some work so you can check up to see how you're doing, see if the information is making sense and you're following along. Now, before we get going on this, in order to do this, either you'll need some type of software program. Jhora is probably the best free one out there for Jyotish, well known. Sri Jyotish Star has a really nice function where it can generate the Panchang for you, and there's also online some places called like mypanchang.com or Jurik Panchang. So there's some free online websites that also give you the Panchang. Or a lot of times if you have a local Indian community, there's also oftentimes local Panchang makers that can make Panchangs local to your time zone. So the Panchang has to be as close as possible to the city you're at, because it's very, like anything in Jyotish, it's location specific. So if you don't have some of those softwares, You can look on My Panchang is good. They have a nice tabular format for the Panchang, so it's easy to see all the elements kind of laid out there. And just and so you're going to need to get some type of some type of reference material for this to uncover, which shouldn't be too hard. But just one thing to note is usually in the Panchang, if you look at like mypanchang.com or the Panchang makers, usually they list when you're looking at the yoga of the day or the nakshatra or all these different functions. Usually the time listed for those is the end time. It's when that specific item ends. So it's not when it starts, which can be confusing for some people. So watch out for that and make sure you're reading the chart clearly. Double check with your software if you need to, or you can double check with me if you need to, but just make sure you're reading those charts clearly because they can completely throw you off. It's not that hard once you get the hang of it, but just keep in mind, usually it's the end time that they're listing there in those. So those are the basics. And the first thing we'll look at is the durations of these different elements. So as the focus will primarily be on Panchang, Vara, which is the day,